Hey everyone, just imagine that you're out exploring one of America's most famous national parks, surrounded by incredible natural beauty. But then you encounter something that doesn't belong, something massive and decidedly not natural. What would you do if you came face to face with what seemed to be a creature that shouldn't exist? That's the terrifying situation one family from Ohio found themselves in during what was supposed to be a relaxing trip to Yellowstone National Park. So, hitch up your britches and settle in as we listen to the unbelievable experience that happened to them. Our family is from Columbus, Ohio. My dad, Mitchell, is 46 and works as an electrician. My mom, Janice, is 43 and is a nurse at our local hospital. As for me and my siblings, I'm the oldest at 18 years old. My brother Logan is 16 and my little sister Emma is 12. We'd been planning this trip to Yellowstone for months, since it was the first real vacation we'd taken in years. Both my parents work a ton of hours to support us, so we were all really looking forward to getting away. On a normal day, my dad is probably the calmest, most level-headed guy you'll meet. He spent countless nights camping, hiking, and doing all sorts of outdoor activities his whole life, which is why what happened in those Yellowstone woods seemed to rattle him at his core. When we got back home to Ohio, he was having restless nights and daytime flashbacks about the encounter for weeks. So let me tell you exactly what happened. It was the summer of 2022, and my family had planned a trip to Yellowstone National Park. We were all really excited to see the geysers, hot springs, and wildlife up close. Our first few days there were amazing. We hiked some trails, saw bison and elk roaming freely, and just took in the natural beauty of the park. Then, on our fourth day there, something really bizarre happened. We had just finished a long hike and were resting near this heavily wooded area off the beaten path. My dad went to use the restroom behind some trees, and after a few minutes we heard him shouting and crashing sounds like he was running through the woods. He came bursting out looking panicked and out of breath. "We need to get out of here now," he yelled. We all jumped up, terrified, and started quickly packing our stuff. "What happened?" my mom asked urgently. Dad looked rattled as he explained. "I saw something. It wasn't a bear or any normal animal. It was huge, way bigger than a grizzly, and it walked upright like a human, covered in thick dark hair all over. It turned and looked right at me with these sunken, glowing eyes. Then it opened its mouth and let out this deafening roar that shook the trees around us." We were all frozen in fear at this point. Dad kept looking like he expected this thing to come charging out of the woods at any second. That's when he said, "It started moving towards me, taking these gigantic strides. That's when I turned and ran for my life back here." Somehow we managed to grab our gear and get out of there fast. The whole time we were frantically packing up our gear, Dad kept glancing over his shoulder towards those woods. His hands were shaking as he crammed things into his backpack. Not that any of us blamed him after what he'd seen back there. What made it even worse was the sound he described, that hair-raising roar that seemed to rattle the trees themselves. Dad has always been an avid outdoorsman, but he said this blood-curdling bellow was like nothing he'd ever heard before from any normal forest animal. Just the mere memory of it left him ashen-faced and jumpy. Needless to say, we didn't linger in that area a second longer than necessary before hightailing it out of there. We drove straight to the ranger station, my dad still visibly shaken. He reported the encounter, describing the massive, ape-like creature in as much detail as he could. The rangers said they'd look into it, but from the looks on their faces, I never thought they really would. So after they essentially brushed off Dad's report about seeing that massive, ape-like creature in the woods, you could tell it really got under his skin. His eyebrows furrowed and his jaw clenched as he tried to recount every specific detail, desperately wanting them to take it seriously. But they just had this sort of polite, indulgent look on their faces like they were humoring a crazy person. Mom looked anxiously between Dad and the rangers, willing them with her eyes to believe us. I felt annoyed seeing them treat my dad's terrifying encounter with such nonchalance after he was so shaken up by it. Even Logan and Emma could sense the tension and disbelief hanging in the air. As we walked back to our car, Mom put her arm around Dad, sympathizing how maddening it was for the Rangers to just write it off as some tall tale. Dad sighed and shook his head, knowing he saw what he saw, regardless of whether they believed him or not. Nonetheless, it put a cloud over the rest of our time there, leaving us all with this nagging feeling like something wasn't quite right about the way they dismissed it so easily. To this day, I'm not sure what my dad saw out there in those Yellowstone woods. All I know is he was absolutely terrified, more scared than I've ever seen him. We left the park right after that and cut our trip short. Was it some kind of undiscovered beast, a vengeful spirit, or just his mind playing tricks? I may never know the truth, but that day will always stay burned into my memory. It was early June, and my friend Jake and I had driven up to Yellowstone National Park for a camping trip over the weekend. We picked a pretty secluded spot away from the main campsites, about a half-mile hike off the main trail. Friday night was totally normal. We set up the tent, got a fire going, cooked up some food. Around midnight, we crawled into the tent and crashed. I woke up at like 3 a.m. needing to pee. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the woods to do my business. That's when I heard something big moving around out there. I froze and strained my eyes, but it was hard to see much in the dark with just the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. After a few seconds, I could make out something massive, maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, walking upright just 30 yards away. It seemed to be sniffing the air. I stood there motionless, not making a sound, just watching this huge creature lumbering around. My heart was pounding out of my chest. Then it turned its head and I could make out 2 bright eyes reflecting the moonlight, staring right at me. That's when I realized this thing knew I was there. It took a few steps towards me, still sniffing. I could hear its heavy footsteps crunching on the leaves and undergrowth. My mind was racing. What the hell was this thing? A bear, maybe? No, it was way too tall and walked upright. Some forest rangers in a ghillie suit messing with campers, but it moved all wrong, almost ape-like. Just then, Jake unzipped the tent and whisper yelled, "Dude, what's taking so long?" The creature immediately turned and looked right at the tent where the sound came from. It let out this crazy growling roar that I'll never forget. Jake shouted, "Holy shit!" from inside the tent. That's when the creature took off running straight towards our tent site. That massive creature charged right towards our tent, covering the 30 yards in just a few huge strides. Jake was screaming from inside the tent as it barreled down on us. I had no idea what to do. My mind went totally blank with fear. Part of me thought I should try to fight this thing off, but it was incredibly large and powerful looking. Another part of me wanted to just run, but I knew that tent was our only real shelter. When the creature was maybe 10 yards away, it reared up on its hind legs, throwing its head back. It unleashed another earth-shaking roar that seemed to go on forever. I'll never forget the sight of its silhouette against the night sky, easily 9 feet tall, thick arms raising up. That's when I noticed the stench. A thick, rotting smell like decaying meat overwhelmed me, and I had to fight back, vomiting. The roar finally stopped and the creature dropped back down on all fours. For a moment, everything was deathly silent and still. Jake had gone quiet inside the tent. Then the creature started sidling up towards the tent, shoulders hunched, almost like it was stalking prey. I could make out its form a bit better now that it was closer. Massive, rounded shoulders, like a silverback gorilla, but far bigger. A thick snout with wicked teeth bared, and those eyes, still glowing in the dark, locked right on the tent. It pulled up a few feet from the tent, and I could sense it was getting ready to attack. I braced myself with the large branch gripped tightly in both hands. In one explosive motion, the thing pounced, swiping a giant paw towards the roof of our tent with tremendous force. There was a deafening ripping sound as its claws sliced clean through the tent fabric. Jake let out a blood-curdling scream as part of the tent collapsed inwards from the impact. I saw his legs and sleeping bag get violently thrown aside as the creature's paw entered the tent. Not knowing what else to do, I charged at the thing while its arm was still inside the compromised tent. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I swung the heavy branch like a baseball bat, making direct contact with the back of the creature's arm. It yanked its arm out of the tent immediately, turning its glowing eyes towards me. A deep, gurgling growl rumbled from its throat as it began stalking in my direction, hunched over on all fours. Broken tent poles and shredded fabric were scattered everywhere. Suddenly, Jake burst out of the remains of the tent, clutching a camping hatchet. "Get away from him," he shouted at the top of his lungs. The creature's head whipped around, startled by Jake's voice. Taking advantage of the split-second distraction, I swung the branch again, whacking the side of the thing's head with every ounce of force I could muster. It staggered sideways a few steps, letting out a piercing yelp. For a brief moment, I thought maybe it would retreat. But then it steadied itself, and its haunting, glowing eyes fixed on us again with an absolutely primal, merciless look. That's when we heard crashing sounds in the distance, like several other large animals were approaching our position at a dead run. The crashing sounds grew rapidly louder, like a herd of elephants charging through the forest. Suddenly, bright lights began piercing through the trees, large, powerful flashlight beams sweeping back and forth. "You boys need to get out of here right now," a deep voice shouted from the darkness. "We've got this situation contained, but it's not safe." A group of 5 or 6 armed rangers emerged from the tree line, lights probing the area around our demolished campsite. The creature snarled and faced them defensively on its hind legs. One of the rangers shouted something into his radio, and seconds later a deafening pulse of sound ripped through the air. It was some kind of high-pitched sonic weapon that caused the massive cryptid to buckle and shriek in pain, dropping to all fours. The rangers immediately opened fire on the thing with tranquilizer darts, rapidly firing several rounds that impacted its huge body one after another. It charged a few yards before stumbling and crashing to the ground, darts protruding from its back and thick neck. "Don't move, we're coming to get you," another ranger called out as the team cautiously approached, rifles still trained on the now motionless creature. 2 rangers reached us and quickly ushered us away from the scene to safety, while the others secured the cryptid with restraints and a body bag for transportation. We were rushed to the Rangers' mobile command center and thoroughly checked over, though miraculously we only had minor cuts and bruises from the tent destruction. After giving statements about our bizarre encounter, we were driven to our vehicle and asked to leave the park, saying that it was for our own safety, but who really knows? To this day, we have no idea what that thing was or where the Rangers took it. The official report from Yellowstone lists our incident as simply an animal attack, but Jake and I know we experienced something much stranger and more unexplainable that night out in those woods. Thought I'd share a strange experience of mine. This happened to me while I was up in Michigan. Spent some time on Royale National Park. It's this pristine little chunk of wilderness in Lake Superior. You have to take a ferry to get there, so it's generally pretty secluded. Not a whole lot of tourists like some of the other national parks around. Not like Yellowstone or anything where you're trapped with herds of tourists and camper vans. The place is filled with beautiful hiking trails and green forests as far as the eye can see. It's just you, nature, and the wild creatures that inhabit the island. I went there to be alone, to escape the concrete maze of the city I live in and breathe some fresh air. I was tired and the constant noise and clutter of people got unbearable. I actually picked Royale because it's the least visited national park in the country. I had been there for a couple of days already, enjoying the peace and quiet. I'd brought some bird-watching gear and a good pair of binoculars. You'd be surprised at the variety of avian life in this place. I spent my days hiking around, stopping to watch the different species of birds and take notes, appreciating the untouched beauty of the place. It was just what I needed. On the third day, I decided to hike deeper into the park. I went for a trail in the north section of the park that was a bit more isolated. By the time the sun was starting to hang low in the sky, I was about as far in as anyone could get. The stillness was almost palpable. It was just the rustle of leaves, bird calls, and the crunching of twigs beneath my boots. That's when I first heard it. This weird, dull clicking noise, the kind an insect makes, but much louder. It seemed to echo around me, bouncing off the trees. When I stopped to listen closer, it'd stop. And as soon as I'd start to move, it'd start up again. I thought it was probably just a woodpecker or something. I'm no bird expert, after all. But that wasn't the end of it, not at all. The clicking noise was merely the beginning of what was about to be one of the weirdest nights I've ever experienced. It started to get dark as I made my way back to my camping spot. The clicking sound had faded, and I'd all but forgotten about it. But it snuck up on me again, louder and more distinct. Every hair on my body stood up. Had this thing followed me all this way? The stillness in the forest felt unnatural. I felt watched. I quickened my pace. The clicking seemed to follow me. I was certain of it now. My heart was pounding in my chest. The rational part of my mind told me it was probably just some harmless animal, but instinct was screaming at me to get out of there ASAP. Then I saw it. It was far off, so at first I mistook it for a part of the natural landscape. But when it started to move, my heart nearly stopped. This creature, pale as the moon, was crawling on all fours and making that dreadful clicking noise with its mouth. It had this long, gaunt body. I wasn't close enough to make out detailed features, but its eyes, even from a distance, were large and shiny, like two huge obsidian stones. It didn't have a nose that I could see. Its mouth seemed too large for its face. It was unlike anything I had ever seen or could imagine. Parts of it almost looked human, but it was something straight out of a nightmare. I've never felt fear like this before. It's like every fiber of your being knows something is very, very wrong. Quickly, I switched off my flashlight and hid behind some foliage. The edges of the creature's body shimmered in the moonlight. It moved surprisingly gracefully through the trees. It passed by without noticing me, but I remained still for what seemed like hours, listening to the sound of the clicking gradually fade. After the encounter, my first thought was to pack up and leave. But sleep came to claim me in exhaustion, and by morning the fear seemed less real and more like a half-remembered nightmare. I spent the next day questioning everything. What had I seen? An animal, a trick of the evening light, or something more sinister? Something well beyond the bounds of my understanding? I don't know, and I'm not sure I need an answer. But those few horrifying moments amidst the beauty of the wilderness were enough to leave a lasting impression. Isle Royale was so beautiful and full of life, but I couldn't shake off the memory of what I had seen. And as much as I was relieved to return home, I left a little piece of my brave spirit in that forest, and the dark clicking still echoes in my mind from time to time. It reminds us city dwellers that there's so much we don't know about this world. For years, it was under our noses. That's what really gets under my skin, you know? I hate how close we were to this thing without ever realizing it. Maybe some of our tragedies could have been avoided, but then again, maybe not. My dad and I used to fish at a creek. We started when I was young and continued doing it until he passed. I kept going to the same spot when I needed some advice. Sometimes it felt like he was still there with me. Sometimes I even heard his voice. Other times I knew it was something else with me in that creek. Something dangerous. The first time we saw it, we were together. We didn't know it then, but we probably looked right at the thing. We told my mother about it that night, although we definitely described it all wrong. I'm not sure that I could describe it now, even though I've seen it a half dozen more times. That first time, we cast our lines over the side of the wooden bridge that crossed the flowing water. We liked having something to lean on, set our drinks in, whatever. That was our spot. One time, we heard a loud splashing further up the creek. We thought it was another fisherman or maybe an animal. When we looked, and I know this sounds crazy, we saw a fish jump clear out of the water. I don't mean up and then back in, either. It jumped up and into the trees, disappeared into the forestry, like something had hit a home run on the poor thing. We told ourselves that a bird must have grabbed it. We didn't see a bird. There wasn't one to see. That time, we didn't see anything. I'm not sure why. Maybe we weren't ready to see it. Our second encounter, I think, happened when my dad was alone. I was busy with college, so he came by himself more and more frequently. Maybe he was out there pretending to talk to me. I don't know. The thought makes me feel nice. I got a call from my mother not long after that trip. My dad was sick, ghost white, she said. And when I got home, he was sweating, complaining about the cold and staring wide-eyed out the window. I think now he was just afraid. I think he saw the thing again, saw it for real. Maybe it came after him. He never went back to our spot. I was too busy to drag him myself, and the old man passed a few years later. I didn't return to the creek for a while yet. When I first got back, I'd completely forgotten about the flying fish. I'd forgotten about my dad's white face and where he'd been right before that terror had gripped him. I was just missing him. I wanted to reconnect. I thought the water, the fish, and the peace and quiet would do me a lot of good. I didn't find any peace out there. It was broad daylight. I cast my line over the railing, same as always. Deep into the afternoon, I heard something. A twig broke. Deer were coming through, I thought. The bushes rattled, and I thought for sure I'd see one come trotting up to the water. Nothing showed up. I could see and hear the foliage as it swayed and snapped, reacting to the weight of some animal. But I never saw the animal. Even when the bushes parted and something stepped through the empty space, I didn't see it. I stared, I sweat, and I trembled, but I did not see it. I didn't see it until it crouched by the waterside and dipped its hands into the stream. I saw water run down the shape of human arms. I saw it drip down the lips of a wide, hungry mouth. But I couldn't see its body, its skin. Not really. It was clear. When it moved, it looked like a spot in the world was wrapped in plastic. It shimmered just enough for me to distinguish a translucent humanoid shape. It was something invisible. It was something that didn't want to be seen. I don't know if I gasped or yelped or tripped over my own fishing pole. I only know that I suddenly made a noise and the thing that I couldn't see turned toward me. I saw prints press into the wet earth that disappeared as it walked toward the bridge. I heard something scratching at the wooden structure climbing up from underneath. The invisible thing growled like a mother bear protecting her young. So I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't go back. I ran, and I stayed gone. The invisible, shimmering thing must have plucked that fish from the water all those years ago. It must have leaped back into the forest to eat, leaving us scratching our heads. My dad knew it. He learned the truth before I did. He learned that all the time we were fishing, we were squatting in the den of some mysterious beast. I was cold for a while. I was afraid. Then I remembered that my father let this thing chase him away from our spot, right under our noses all along, and we didn't have the good sense to chase it away. We just let it spook us. We let it take the place that should have been reserved for my best memories. That was years ago now. I've been searching for my courage, I guess. Maybe I was just waiting for the day that I had nothing to lose. I wouldn't say I'm at that point, not exactly. But I do know it's time. I'm going back to that creek, and whatever that thing is, I'm chasing it out of there. I'll root it out from under that bridge if that's where it lives. I'll run it into the woods and I'll hunt it down if I have to. My father feared this thing until the day that he died. I'm determined not to let it ruin my life, too. One day, a few years back, in the heart of spring, I found myself walking amidst the towering, majestic sequoias of Redwood National and State Parks in California. Well, this wasn't just any random day. I chose to commune with nature. It was my birthday weekend, and I decided to take a little getaway from the hustle and bustle of San Francisco, where I work in tech. Probably sounds cliche, but I had this powerful calling towards the grandeur of these colossal giants. Trotting through the neatly marked hiking trails, I couldn't help but marvel at the surreal surroundings. All you hear about Redwood before you visit is how astounding it is. But let me tell you, no postcard or documentary could ever do justice to the real deal. The earthy smell filled the air, and the cool forest floor felt therapeutic under my boots. I spent the day hiking, stopping occasionally for some trail mix and water, or to capture some shots for my scrapbook. As the shadows grew long, I decided to head back to my little rented cabin. After all, the park wasn't famous just for its beautiful daytime sights. The nighttime sky was rumored to be a spectacle in itself. One of these nights, while sitting on the porch of my cabin, trying to catch some shots of the night sky, I noticed a strange sound emerging from the dark forest. Initially, it seemed like a far-off echo, but progressively, it grew louder and clearer, stirring the serene silence of the night. It emanated as the strangest growl I ever heard in my life. My initial instinct was to retreat into the safety of the cabin, but curiosity had its grip on me. This sound, both intriguing and petrifying, was something raw, something primal, and something clearly not of the everyday world. As a city guy, my encounters with wildlife were confined to squirrels in the park or seagulls at the beach. But this seemed different. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. Oddly though, I wasn't overwhelmed by fear, just an overwhelming sense of anticipation about what was coming next. Amidst the shadows, I noticed a tall, bushy silhouette slowly emerge. The figure was bulky and bordering on gargantuan. It was a good 8 or 9 feet tall easily. In stark contrast to the slender tree trunks around it, the entity appeared, sturdy, almost hulking. Suddenly, a horrifying, primordial roar echoed through the forest, freezing me to the spot, my heart hammering in my chest. The roar was so gut-wrenching it made the sounds of the ordinary wilderness inhabitants pale in comparison. I squinted into the darkness, managing to make out the figure in a semi-clear patch bathed in faint moonlight. The creature had a browny-red tinge to its massive body. It looked to be covered in long, unruly hair throughout its body, except for the face. Its eyes seemed almost human, like the creature was a mixture of man and ape. I had no doubt I was looking at a Sasquatch. In that moment, my mind was a whirlpool of fear, confusion, and a bizarre sense of awe. The creature roared again and then disappeared among the trees. It was gone as suddenly as it had arrived. What remained was an overpowering, pungent smell, like moldy wood left out in the rain. I blinked, my eyes wide open, momentarily stunned. I managed to make my way back to my cabin, my heart still pounding. During my retreat, I could still hear the occasional bark, like grunt, echoing in the distance, along with the persistent, nauseating smell. But the creature never bothered me. It just seemed to want to be left alone. I left the redwoods with little more than a memory and a tall tale of my encounter. No one at home believed me, but I know what I saw, and I know there are creatures out there that aren't in the encyclopedia books. I still consider myself a healthy skeptic about these things, but sometimes, just sometimes, legends turn out to be real. Back in 1994, I saw something that I'll never forget. It was pretty late at night, around 2 to 3 a.m., and I was working on scraping all the snow off my car window since my job required me to get up early and leave early. It was at least an hour commute, and I had to be there by 4:30 sharp. And in this point in time, I was in easily the worst shape of my life. This was long before I got myself into shape, and at the time I was drinking copious amounts of coffee, energy drinks, and anything I could just to function during the day. I was getting terrible sleep too, probably due to my diet. I mention this because I tried to rationalize if I hallucinated what happened. Anyway, after getting all the snow off my car, I got in and started heading to work when I saw the strangest animal of my life approach approaching my vehicle from the front, and my mind began racing as I realized just how large this thing was. And then it did something more terrifying than you could ever imagine. Whatever this thing was, stood up on 2 legs and crossed the road right up to my vehicle, crouched down on one knee, and looked directly at me through the front window. It had dark, reddish-brown fur covering its entire body. I'll never forget how scared I was. It was even taller, standing up on 2 legs than the very top of my car, and it stood very comfortably like that, just like a man would. The face was what really stuck out to me and what really gave it away as something not of this world. It looked like a cross between a wolf and a monkey's face with a pronounced brow, large jawbones, and a mouth full of long, sharp teeth. It also had a shorter, more condensed muzzle. It also had human-like characteristics to its face, more around the corners of its mouth and its eyes, like it could make a proper expression. Frozen and terrified and not sure what I should do, I slammed the car into drive, putting my foot all the way down on the gas pedal as if I had a lead foot. I flew forward, and this thing dove out of the way just in time to avoid being hit, even though it's not like me hitting it with my tiny car would have done anything to hurt it. My car would have been the one to take the damage from whatever this thing was. But when it leaped out of the way, it was lightning fast. Inhumanly possible. Like, in the blink of an eye, it was just gone out of the way, and I drove and sped off onto the road leading away from my house. I flew out of there much faster than I should have. In fact, I'm surprised I didn't lose control and wreck. It was considerably cold that morning, and there was lots of ice and moisture on the road. I could have easily flown off the road and hit a tree, but at the time of it all happening, I didn't care. In fact, I wasn't even really thinking. Just reacting. Anything to get me away from whatever that creature was. And that's it. That's the end of my encounter. But every morning, I still wonder if I'm going to see it again.